April 2015. The usually quiet Hatton Garden jewellery district in London was bustling with activity, but beneath the surface, something extraordinary was happening. Deep within the vault of the Hatton Garden Safe Deposit Company, a team of elderly men, later nicknamed the Diamond Wheezers, were carrying out one of the most audacious heists in British history. They had breached the vault wall, their hands covered in dust, eyes fixed on the prize behind the thick metal door. As they ransacked safety deposit boxes, they were unaware that their actions would soon capture the attention of the entire world. But to understand the true story of the Hatton Garden heist, we must first go back to where it all began. To Brian Reader, the mastermind who had been planning something like this for decades. To understand how the Hatton Garden heist came to be, we need to dive into the mind of Brian Reader, the man who orchestrated this incredible feat. Born in 1939, Reader grew up in South London, a time and place that was a breeding ground for some of the UK's most notorious criminals. Raised during post-war Britain, his environment was tough. Opportunities were scarce, and young men often found themselves drawn to the allure of quick money, even if it meant breaking the law. Reader, however, wasn't just a petty criminal. From an early age, he displayed an uncanny intelligence, a sharp mind that seemed almost too big for his surroundings. As a child, Reader was fascinated with mechanics. He would spend hours dismantling old clocks and appliances, his young mind always curious to understand how things worked. His fascination with understanding intricate systems and exploiting their weaknesses would be a theme that followed Brian throughout his life. In his teenage years, he began to associate with older boys known for petty thefts. It wasn't long before Reader's intelligence and calm demeanor led him to become the planner, rather than just another participant. He quickly learned that the real money lay not in simple thefts, but in grand schemes. Heists that required patience, intelligence, and precise execution. He became a student of the criminal world, learning every trick, every method, and every weakness in the system. Reader's rise to notoriety began with his involvement in one of the most infamous crimes in British history, the Brink's-Mat robbery of 1983. It was during this heist that he earned the nickname the Master. The heist involved the theft of £26 million in gold bullion from the Heathrow International Trading Estate, an amount so staggering that it sent shockwaves through the world. This was no ordinary theft. It required insider knowledge, meticulous planning, and nerves of steel. Reader played a crucial role, using his strategic thinking to navigate the complex logistics of the operation. It was during the Brink's-Mat heist that Reader became known for his incredible ability to stay calm under pressure, to think 3 steps ahead, and to use his intellect to outmaneuver law enforcement. Despite the huge success of the Brink's-Mat heist, it came with consequences. Many of Reader's accomplices ended up in prison or worse. The gold bullion was eventually traced, and several members of the gang were caught. Reader, however, managed to slip away relatively unscathed. He understood that the key to a successful life in crime wasn't just about pulling off the heist. It was about staying out of sight afterward, about keeping a low profile when others basked in the glory. This philosophy of staying under the radar was something that would define his entire criminal career. By the time Brian Reader reached his 70s, many of his contemporaries had retired, been caught, or passed away. But Reader wasn't like most men his age. While many were settling into a life of relaxation and grandchildren, Reader was still driven by the thrill of the heist. He had seen it all: the evolution of law enforcement tactics, the rise of new security technologies, and the way the world had become more connected. Yet, he believed that the older methods, the tried and tested, still had their place. In fact, the very idea of pulling off another major heist was something that kept him going, something that made him feel alive. He had begun to think of one last job, a final masterpiece that would cement his legacy as one of the greatest criminal masterminds of all time. Reader's health had started to decline, but his mind remained sharp. He began reconnecting with old contacts, reaching out to others who had spent a lifetime in the shadows of London's underworld. He wasn't interested in money as much as he was in the challenge, the puzzle that needed solving. Hatton Garden, the jewellery district of London, was well known for its wealth, and the Hatton Garden Safe Deposit Company was the crown jewel, a place rumored to hold untold riches behind its fortified walls. Reader began to put together a team, men who, like him, had lived lives on the wrong side of the law, men who had the experience, the skills, and most importantly, the desire to be part of something historic. What drives a 76-year-old man to mastermind a heist of this scale? For Brian Reader, it wasn't simply about the money. It was about proving that he still had it, that even in his twilight years he could outthink, outmaneuver, and outplay both the system and the authorities. Psychologists have often pointed to a desire for control, a need to impose one's will on an otherwise indifferent world, as a motivating factor for people like Reader. The heist was his way of asserting that he was still relevant, that he could still make an impact. Reader also seemed to relish the camaraderie that came with planning a heist. He had always been a leader, someone others looked to for guidance and direction. And as he began assembling his team for the Hatton Garden heist, he found himself invigorated by the sense of purpose it gave him. He was no longer just a retiree living out his days. He was once again the mastermind, orchestrating something that would make headlines around the world. For Reader, the thrill of the heist wasn't just in the execution. It was in the planning, in the assembling of the pieces, in the challenge of doing what others deemed impossible. By late 2014, Reader had begun assembling his team. There was Terry Perkins, an old associate who, like Reader, was no stranger to high-stakes crime. Perkins was known for his determination and his willingness to take risks. Then there was John Collins, also known as Kenny, a man who had been in and out of prison for much of his life but who still had the skills and the drive needed for a job like this. Daniel Jones, a man 20 years younger than Reader, was brought in for his expertise in drilling and entry, essential skills for what they were planning. Carl Wood and William Lincoln rounded out the team, each bringing their own unique set of skills to the table. The men, most of whom were in their 60s and 70s, began meeting regularly. They were careful, using burner phones, meeting in locations they thought were off the radar, and discussing every detail of their plan. They knew the risks. They were well aware that modern surveillance made things much more challenging than in the past. But they also believed in their own abilities. They had experience, and they had patience. They believed that the very fact that they were older would work in their favor. Who would suspect a group of pensioners of planning one of the biggest heists in history? The planning took months, with every detail scrutinized and every possible complication accounted for. As they finalized their plans, the anticipation began to build. They knew that over the Easter weekend of 2015, the Hatton Garden Safe Deposit Company would be empty. They knew the security measures, the layout of the building, the routines of the security personnel. They believed they had thought of everything. But as they prepared for the heist, they couldn't have known that their actions would lead to one of the most intense police investigations London had ever seen. And so, with the pieces in place, Brian Reader and his crew prepared to do the unthinkable, to break into the heart of London's jewelry district and make off with millions in cash, jewelry, and other valuables. What would happen next would shock not only the people of London, but the entire world. Stay tuned as we explore the lives of the other members of the Diamond Wheezers, and how their pasts led them to be part of this audacious heist. Each of these men had their own reasons for joining Brian Reader in his final grand scheme, and together, they would attempt to pull off one of the most notorious heists in British history. April 3, 2015. The dark basement of the Hatton Garden Safe Deposit Company was filled with the echoing sound of drills and the grunts of men who were pushing themselves beyond their limits. Dust filled the air, and the tension was palpable. They had done it. They had managed to bore a hole through the concrete to breach one of the most secure vaults in London. But what led this crew of elderly men, who could easily be mistaken for grandfathers out on a shopping trip, to pull off one of the most daring heists in recent memory? To understand the full picture, we need to delve into the past lives of each of these men. What made them join Brian Reader in his quest to defy the odds? Terry Perkins was no stranger to the world of crime. Born in 1947, Terry was known in London's underworld as a man willing to take risks, sometimes calculated, sometimes reckless. He had spent much of his life walking a tightrope between freedom and prison, and the thrill of the heist was something he couldn't resist. In 1983, the same year Brian Reeder made headlines for the Brinksmat robbery, Perkins was already making his mark on the criminal scene. He had been involved in a major armed robbery, and despite being caught and serving time, his appetite for high-stakes crime never wavered. The Hatton Garden heist wasn't just about money for the men involved. It was a chance for something far more profound. Terry Perkins, driven by the adrenaline rush he hadn't felt in years, was captivated by the challenge and danger of the job. Despite his deteriorating health due to diabetes, he was ready for one last adventure. The heist presented to him by Brian Reeder felt like the ultimate way to prove he was still capable of greatness, a final opportunity to be part of something legendary. Perkins saw this heist as his swan song, a way to go out with a bang. Perkins' family life was strained, with children who barely spoke to him after years of brushes with the law. Yet, despite the emotional distance from his loved ones, the idea of redemption through the heist kept him motivated. It wasn't just the financial reward. It was about proving to himself that he still had what it took to make a mark, to be remembered. John Kenny Collins, at 74, played the role of the watchman. Though he wasn't directly involved in the drilling, his role was crucial, acting as the lookout and ensuring the group had ample warning if anything went awry. Collins grew up in a tough neighborhood where crime was a way of life, and he had spent much of his own life in and out of prison. The heist gave Collins a sense of purpose and camaraderie, allowing him to feel valuable once again. He was methodical, observant, and fiercely loyal, a man who could blend into any situation. Despite his advanced age, Collins was still ready to prove himself as a reliable and integral part of the crew. Collins often lightened the mood during planning, making jokes to ease the tension. But when it was time to work, he was all business. The Hatton Garden job was not only about the potential financial gain, it was about being part of something larger than himself, a chance to show that he still mattered in a world that often dismissed those who were past their prime. Daniel Jones, at 58, was the youngest of the crew and the one with the skills to break through the vault. Jones had spent years perfecting his craft, learning the intricacies of industrial drilling and engineering, and his expertise was critical to the success of the operation. He idolized the great heists of the past and saw the Hatton Garden job as his opportunity to be part of history. The risks were high, but to Jones, the reward, both in terms of financial gain and personal fulfillment, was worth it. Jones was also dealing with his own personal struggles. He had significant debts, with loan sharks pressuring him for repayment. The heist was more than just a thrill. It was a lifeline. He needed the money to secure a future for his family and to escape the suffocating grip of debt. This personal pressure weighed heavily on him, and every time he picked up the drill, he was reminded of just how much was at stake. Carl Wood, also 58, was involved in the early stages of planning the heist. He was known for his connections and his ability to source the necessary equipment and information. However, as the plan progressed, Wood began to have doubts. The risks seemed too high, and his cautious nature began to get the better of him. Unlike the others, Wood made the difficult decision to back out, recognizing that the heist could cost him his freedom and separate him from his family forever. Wood's decision to walk away wasn't easy, knowing it could be seen as betrayal by the rest of the crew, but he had a daughter whom he adored, and the thought of her growing up without a father was something he couldn't bear. He chose to prioritize his family, even though it meant stepping back from what could have been the score of a lifetime. It was a choice that ultimately saved him from the consequences that awaited the others, but it also left him with a lingering sense of what might have been. William Lincoln, known as Billy the Fish, was a 60-year-old handler in the notorious Diamond Wheezers heist. He wasn't interested in the thrill of breaking into a vault, but was critical to the operation, using his black market connections to move the stolen valuables. Lincoln was careful, well-connected, and determined to get a significant payday from the heist. Loyalty was everything to him. Past betrayals had made him cautious. He expected the crew to stick to the plan and remain silent afterward. As the team, led by Mastermind Brian Reeder, came together, tensions rose. Lincoln, along with the rest of the group, knew the risks. Failure could mean years in prison. They were aiming to break into one of London's most secure vaults, stealing millions in cash, jewelry, and valuables. Despite arguments and moments of doubt, Reader's leadership kept the group together. Lincoln and the others had invested too much to back out. The pressure was immense, but the men believed in their plan, each other, and Brian Reader. As they prepared for the heist, the tension escalated. They were about to risk everything for glory, one last chance to prove themselves. The countdown had begun. It was early 2015, and the men who would become known as the Diamond Wheezers were in the final stages of planning their daring heist. The stakes were enormous, and each of them knew the risks they were taking. If they succeeded, they would make history, pulling off one of the most lucrative heists in British history. If they failed, they would spend the rest of their lives behind bars. Brian Reader, the 76-year-old mastermind of the operation, was the glue holding everything together. He had assembled a team that consisted of seasoned criminals, each with their own unique set of skills. Men who had been involved in heists before and knew the risks involved. Terry Perkins, John Kenny Collins, Daniel Jones, Carl Wood, and William Lincoln were all ready to make their mark on history. They spent weeks meticulously planning every detail, going over the blueprints, studying security protocols, and practicing their entry and exit strategies. The target was the Hatton Garden Safe Deposit Company, located in the heart of London's jewellery district. It was a vault that had been deemed impenetrable, a fortress where the wealthy kept their most valuable possessions. But to the men of the Diamond Wheezers, it was a challenge they couldn't resist. Over months of planning, they scouted the area, monitored the building's activity, and gathered information on everything from security systems to the daily routines of the people who worked there. It was clear from the start that this wasn't going to be easy, but that only made the heist more appealing to the men involved. Brian Reader led the planning with military precision. Every movement was coordinated, every possible contingency discussed. He knew they would need to get past multiple layers of security, alarms, CCTV cameras, and a heavy-duty vault door. Reader's experience from past heists, including the Brinks-Mat robbery, was invaluable. He used every bit of his expertise to ensure they had the best possible chance of success. The men practiced drills for entering and exiting the building, rehearsing how they would bypass security systems and how they would react if anything went wrong. It was an elaborate operation that required not just skill, but also nerves of steel. The night of April 2nd, 2015, was the moment of truth. The plan was set into motion over the Easter weekend, a time when the entire district would be quieter than usual, with businesses closed for the holiday. It was the perfect time to strike, and the men knew it. Brian Reader, dressed as an elderly man going about his business, was the first to arrive. He calmly approached the communal entrance to the Hatton Garden Safe Deposit Company, and within moments, he had gained entry. The team moved quickly, making their way through the building, disabling the elevator and descending down the shaft to the basement. The group was a mix of nerves and adrenaline, each man knowing exactly what was at stake. In the basement, they came face to face with their greatest challenge yet, a 50-centimeter thick concrete wall that stood between them and the treasures they sought. Daniel Jones, the expert driller, took center stage. He had spent weeks preparing for this very moment, knowing that his skills were the key to getting through the wall. The drill they used was an industrial diamond-tipped drill, a piece of equipment capable of boring through the thick concrete wall that protected the vault. It was loud, it was slow, and it was exhausting work. Dust filled the air as Jones worked the drill, sweat pouring down his face as he focused on the task at hand. The other men worked in silence, each doing their part to keep the operation running smoothly. Terry Perkins stood watch, his eyes darting around, making sure there were no unexpected interruptions. John Collins, the watchman, kept his ear to the ground, ready to sound the alarm if anything went wrong. The drilling took hours, each moment filled with tension as they worked to break through the barrier. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they did it. They had managed to bore a hole through the vault wall, a hole just big enough for them to squeeze through. One by one, the men entered the vault, their flashlights cutting through now. Satinada through the darkness as they looked around at the rows of safety deposit boxes. This was it. This was what they had been working towards. Once inside the vault, the men got to work. They ransacked 73 safety deposit boxes, each of them filled with cash, jewelry, and other valuables. They moved quickly, knowing that time was not on their side. They filled bags with whatever they could find: gold, diamonds, watches, anything that had value. The men worked in near silence, the only sounds the clinking of jewelry and the rustling of cash as they emptied the boxes. Terry Perkins, despite his age and health issues, moved with the energy of a much younger man. For him, this was the moment he had been waiting for: the thrill, the adrenaline, the feeling of being alive. Daniel Jones, his hands still shaking from the hours of drilling, couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. They had done it. They had, actually, done it. They had breached the impenetrable vault, and now they were walking away with millions in cash and valuables. John Collins, the watchman, was alert, his eyes darting around the vault, ensuring no one would surprise them. He knew the risks, and he understood that vigilance was critical to their success. William Lincoln, the handler, was busy securing the stolen items, methodically packing them to make sure they could be transported quickly and efficiently. They all knew they were on borrowed time. The job wasn't over until they were out of the building, and every second counted. The men spent hours inside the vault, taking everything they could. When they finally made their way out, they knew they had pulled off something incredible. They left behind a scene of chaos: safety deposit boxes torn open, the vault floor littered with discarded items that they hadn't deemed valuable enough to take. They made their way out the same way they had come in, each of them carrying bags filled with stolen goods. They disappeared into the night, leaving no trace of who they were or where they had gone. The news of the heist broke on April 7, 2015, and it immediately made headlines around the world. The public was in shock. How could a group of elderly men who could easily be mistaken for someone's grandfather, pull off such an audacious crime? The media dubbed them the Diamond Wheezers, a play on their age and the nature of the heist. The story captivated the nation. People were fascinated by the idea of a group of elderly men pulling off a heist that seemed like something out of a Hollywood movie. The Hatton Garden heist was the talk of the town. People couldn't believe that a group of men in their 60s and 70s had managed to break into one of the most secure vaults in London and walk away with an estimated £14 million worth of cash, jewelry, and other valuables. It was a story that had everything: mystery, intrigue, and a cast of characters that seemed almost too unbelievable to be true. The public was divided. Some saw the men as folk heroes, a group of elderly criminals who had outsmarted the system. Others saw them as dangerous criminals who had violated the trust of those who had stored their most valuable possessions in the vault. The audacity of the crime captured the public imagination. People were glued to their televisions, watching news reports, interviews, and updates. As the investigation unfolded, the heist seemed to symbolize something deeper: a challenge to authority, a rebellion against the establishment. The elderly nature of the criminals only added to the intrigue. These weren't young men looking for a quick payday, but older, experienced individuals who had spent years in the criminal underworld. But while the public was fascinated by the story, the police were hard at work. The Metropolitan Police launched an extensive investigation, determined to catch the men responsible for the heist. They analyzed CCTV footage, monitored communications, and began piecing together the clues that would eventually lead them to the men behind the crime. The Diamond Wheezers had pulled off the heist of a lifetime, but they had also left behind a trail that the police were determined to follow. The investigation was relentless. Detectives combed through hours of CCTV footage, identifying suspicious movements and tracking down leads. They reviewed phone records, spoke to informants, and began to build a picture of who might be behind the heist. It wasn't long before they had a list of suspects: men with criminal records, men who had the skills and the experience to pull off such a daring job. The net was tightening, and it was only a matter of time before the men who had thought they had gotten away with the perfect crime would find themselves facing justice. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that the police were closing in. The men who had thought they had escaped with millions in cash and valuables were about to face the full force of the law. But for now, the public was left wondering, who were these men? How had they managed to pull off such an incredible heist? And most importantly, would they ever be caught? Were you aware of the Hatton Garden heist when it happened? Did you follow the news as the story unfolded? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And make sure to stay tuned for the next part, where we take you through the police pursuit, the investigation, and the eventual arrests of the men behind the heist. The story is far from over, and there are still plenty of twists and turns to come. By April 2015, the Hatton Garden heist was the most talked about crime in Britain. As the public marveled at the sheer audacity of the heist, the Metropolitan Police were getting to work. The police had been caught off guard, but they were determined not to be made fools of. The Diamond Wheezers had done their best to erase any sign of their presence, but they hadn't anticipated just how determined law enforcement would be. The Hatton Garden Safe Deposit Company had an extensive CCTV system, and the footage from the heist weekend became a goldmine for the police. The detectives painstakingly went through hour after hour of footage, examining every detail. What they found was remarkable. Despite their attempts to blend in, the cameras had captured images of several of the gang members entering and leaving the building. John Kenny Collins's white Mercedes was a significant clue. It was seen parked near the scene on multiple occasions during the heist. The men might have been careful, but the CCTV evidence gave the police a starting point. As the investigation ramped up, the police launched Operation Filbert, a task force specifically designed to track down the perpetrators. Detectives analyzed phone records, traced vehicles, and cross-referenced every available piece of information. They worked around the clock, determined to catch the thieves before they had a chance to disappear with the stolen loot. Tensions ran high within the police department as officers faced pressure from the media and the public to solve the case. The Metropolitan Police couldn't afford another embarrassment. They needed to catch the Diamond Wheezers. The operation grew in size and complexity. Teams of officers were assigned to monitor potential leads, and the pressure on the detectives was immense. The media's continuous coverage of the heist only added to the urgency. Headlines screamed of the daring robbery, and the public was demanding answers. The officers knew they were racing against the clock. The stolen goods were valuable, and if the gang managed to fence them, it would become nearly impossible to recover the full amount. There was a sense of determination, but also anxiety. They had to get it right. Meanwhile, Brian Reeder and the rest of the gang were beginning to feel the heat. From the moment news of the heist broke, they knew they were under scrutiny. Reeder, the eldest of the group and the mastermind behind the heist, watched anxiously as the media frenzy grew. The thrill of the heist had worn off, replaced by a growing sense of paranoia. The police were relentless, and Reeder knew that any mistake could lead them straight to his door. The days following the heist were a blur of tension and fear. Every knock at the door, every unfamiliar car parked on the street, felt like a harbinger of doom. Brian Reeder had always prided himself on his ability to stay one step ahead of the law. He had been involved in high-profile crimes before, most notably the Brinksmat robbery of 1983, and he knew how to keep a low profile. But this time felt different. He was older, slower, and the digital age had changed the game. Surveillance was everywhere, and no matter how careful they had been, there was always a chance they had missed something. Reeder began to question every decision they had made. Had they left a trail? Had someone seen them? Had one of the gang members slipped up? The tension began to gnaw at him. He found himself lying awake at night, replaying every moment of the heist, every conversation, every decision. His health began to suffer. He felt his chest tighten with anxiety, and he grew irritable with those around him. He knew that the police would be methodical, that they wouldn't rest until they had answers. Reeder started to avoid contact with the others. He couldn't afford to be seen with them. The risk was too great. He withdrew, hoping that laying low would buy him some time, but deep down he knew it was only a matter of time. Before the police caught up with them, the stress of the police pursuit began to take its toll on the gang. Paranoia set in, and the once unified team began to fracture. Daniel Jones, who had been instrumental in drilling through the vault wall, was growing increasingly agitated. He had always been prone to anxiety, but the constant pressure was pushing him to the edge. He couldn't sleep, and every time he closed his eyes, he heard the sound of the drill, felt the dust in his lungs, and imagined the police closing in. Jones began to question whether the heist had been worth it. The money, the jewels, none of it mattered if they ended up in prison. Terry Perkins, on the other hand, seemed unfazed. He had been involved in criminal activities for most of his life, and the risk of getting caught was part of the thrill for him. Perkins seemed to thrive under pressure. He enjoyed the adrenaline, the danger, the challenge, but his bravado did little to ease the fears of the others. He would boast that they were too clever to be caught, but his words rang hollow in the face of mounting evidence to the contrary. The cracks were showing, and the group was slowly unraveling. Carl Wood, who had backed out before the heist was completed, was particularly on edge. He regretted his involvement, and he feared that his decision to walk away might have put him at greater risk. He had distanced himself from the group, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every time he left his house, he felt eyes on him. He began to isolate himself, cutting off contact with friends and family, terrified that he would lead the police to the others. The weight of his involvement was crushing him, and he started to consider turning himself in, just to end the nightmare. The gang's unity was crumbling, and Brian Reeder knew that it was only a matter of time before someone made a mistake. The camaraderie they had shared during the planning stages had evaporated, replaced by fear and distrust. Reeder tried to keep everyone calm, but it was no use. The pressure was too much, and the cracks were turning into chasms. Each member of the gang was dealing with the stress in their own way, but none of them could escape the growing sense of doom that loomed over them. The break the police had been waiting for came in early May 2015. As detectives continued to piece together the puzzle, they discovered that the gang had used disposable phones to communicate during the heist. But one of the members, in a moment of carelessness, had used his personal phone to contact another gang member. It was a small slip, but it was enough. The police were able to trace the call, and from there, they began to unravel the network. They identified the individuals involved and began surveillance, watching their every move as they gathered the evidence they needed to make their arrests. The discovery of the phone call was a turning point in the investigation. The police now had names, faces, and addresses. Surveillance teams were deployed, and the detectives began building their case. They watched as the gang members went about their daily lives, oblivious to the fact that they were being monitored. The tension among the officers was palpable. They knew they were getting closer, but they couldn't afford to make a mistake. They needed to be certain that they had enough evidence to secure convictions. It was during this time that Brian Reeder's worst fears were realized. He knew they were being watched. He could feel it. He tried to stay calm, tried to keep a low profile, but it was no use. The police were closing in, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The feeling of powerlessness was unbearable. He had spent his entire life outsmarting the authorities, and now, at 76 years old, it was all slipping away. The thrill of the heist had turned into a nightmare, and all he could do was wait for the inevitable knock at the door. On May 19, 2015, the police made their move. In a coordinated series of raids across London and Kent, they arrested the key members of the Diamond Wheezers. Brian Reeder was arrested at his home in Dartford, Kent. The image of Reeder, an elderly man in handcuffs, being led away by police officers, became an iconic moment, a symbol of the downfall of the gang that had dared to pull off one of the most audacious heists in British history. The raids were meticulously planned. Officers broke down doors, stormed properties, and searched for the stolen goods. Terry Perkins was arrested at his home in Enfield, still defiant despite his age and the overwhelming evidence against him. John Collins, the watchman, was apprehended at his house, his demeanor calm but resigned. Daniel Jones was taken into custody, visibly shaken, the weight of his actions finally catching up to him. Carl Wood, who had been living in fear since the heist, was found hiding at a friend's house, his face pale and drawn. William Lincoln, known as Billy the Fish, was also arrested. The police seized bags of cash, jewelry, and other valuables that had been taken during the heist. The arrests were a major victory for the Metropolitan Police, and they wasted no time in announcing their success to the media. The public, who had been captivated by the story of the heist, watched as the elderly criminals were paraded before the cameras. The arrest of the Diamond Wheezers was just the beginning of the end for the infamous Hatton Garden gang. The real climax would play out in court, where the world watched as these men, who had drilled through concrete, stolen millions, and evaded capture, faced justice. The trial took place at Woolwich Crown Court in early 2016, and the courtroom was filled with onlookers, eager to witness the elderly criminals behind one of the boldest heists in British history. Brian Reeder, John Collins, Terry Perkins, Daniel Jones, Carl Wood, and William Lincoln sat in the dock, frail and aged, yet defiant. The prosecution painted Brian Reeder as the master behind the heist, even at the age of 76. The evidence presented was irrefutable: CCTV footage, phone records, and bags of cash and valuables found during police raids. The prosecution emphasized the precision of the heist, arguing that it was not the work of desperate old men, but rather a calculated crime by seasoned professionals. Witnesses described the technical challenges of drilling into the vault, highlighting the level of planning required. The defense tried to portray the men as relics of a bygone era, aged and harmless. Brian Reeder's lawyer described him as a tired old man, caught up in a reckless adventure, hoping to elicit sympathy. However, the jury remained unmoved by this narrative. The overwhelming evidence left no doubt about their guilt. On March 9, 2016, the jury delivered its verdict. Reeder, Collins, Perkins, and Jones were found guilty of conspiracy to commit burglary, while Wood and Lincoln were also convicted. Hugh Doyle, who played a lesser role, received a suspended sentence. Judge Christopher Kinch, QC, addressed the defendants, highlighting the sophistication of their crime and the emotional distress caused to the victims. Brian Reeder received a sentence of 6 years and 3 months, while Collins, Perkins, and Jones were each given 7 years. Carl Wood and William Lincoln received 6- and 7-year sentences, respectively. For the gang members, this marked the culmination of a lifetime spent in the criminal underworld. As they were led away, resignation replaced their once defiant demeanor. The heist captured public imagination, turning the Diamond Wheezers into unlikely folk heroes. Documentaries, books, and a Hollywood film followed, romanticizing the elderly men who pulled off a daring heist. But beneath the glamour, there were real victims, the owners of the 73 safety deposit boxes. For them, the heist meant the loss of irreplaceable family heirlooms and investments built over a lifetime. In 2019, the story took another turn. Michael Seed, nicknamed Basil, was identified as the alarm specialist who had disabled the security system. After years on the run, Seed was arrested, and in March 2019, he was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Though his arrest provided some closure, questions about the missing loot persisted. The Hatton Garden heist defied expectations, executed not by tech-savvy criminals but by elderly men using old-school methods. It was a crime of audacity and ambition, yet ultimately a failure. The gang was caught, the stolen loot largely unrecovered, and their final adventure ended in prison and public disgrace. Their story serves as a reminder that crime, no matter how cleverly planned, often ends in downfall. The Hatton Garden heist may have been their swan song, but the legacy of the Diamond Wheezers lives on, immortalized in film, books, and public memory. The Diamond Wheezers may have been old, but they proved that age is no barrier to ambition or to folly. Their heist was one for the history books, a tale of daring, audacity, and the inevitable consequences of crime. As we reflect on their story, we are left with one lingering question. Was it worth it? For the thrill of one final adventure, the men lost their freedom, their dignity, and their place in the world. Let us know in the comments what you think. Would you call them fools, heroes, or simply men out of time, chasing a past that had long since slipped away?